We have a very special guest in the studio with me, all the way from the seminary in Goulburn, Father Paul Robinson. Good morning, Father.
Good morning, Charbel.
Thank you for joining us. This is your second time in the studio now.
It is. Thank you so much for having me again.
It's great to have you, and yeah, we'll love to dive in. Father is the author of this book here in my hand, The Realist Guide to Religion and Science. So that's the book there. It's a good volume, very, very thick. Right, it's got lots of information. We're talking about 500 plus pages, and this is well researched, very balanced, and talking about how religion and science can work together. And that's what today's show is going to be about. We're going to dive a bit more into this book and talk further about, is the church against science, yes or no? And we're going to prove that no, it's not. In fact, it invented the scientific method, and we're going to dive into that character today and who did that. So I'm very excited about that. Mark, available on our website right now?
Available on perusiamedia.com, and click on the store link. And there's actually a banner at the top of the store page for that, so you can click on the banner. I think it's on the banner, the carousel of banners that goes around the top of the page. So just click on that particular one, and it'll take you straight to that book.
Great. So perusiamedia.com, available, and we've got a price on that on there. I don't know if Jessie can pull it up at some point, but we'll get it up at some point in the show. She can. But there's the front cover, The Realist Guide to Religion and Science by Father Paul Robinson. I highly recommend you get this book. It's a great read and very informative on a very important topic. Straight into this interview right now. Father, how have you been going? What's new? You were on the show earlier, and we talked a little bit about yourself, and maybe you can update the viewers and listeners about what's been happening since and what's been going on.
Well, I've recently been reassigned, so in fact I'll be leaving Australia after 10 years here. This is
sad news for us.
It's been a great experience being in Australia, teaching at the seminary for 10 years. But missionary priests, we are sent where we're told to go, and we never know. Each year we could be reassigned.
Yes.
And one thing that does for us is it really reinforces that our ministry depends upon the will of God. We don't choose where we live, and so we know that wherever we're sent, it's definitely where God wants us to be. And I think that's an important aspect for a priest, because our life above all has to be something supernatural. So we don't want to ever get the impression that I'm sort of doing this on my own strength, as it were. Yeah. So if you're able to hear the voice of your superiors as the voice of God, I think it tends to work out well. But that voice was communicated to me this year, so I'll be heading to Denver in a few weeks.
Denver, okay. Colorado. Oh
Yes.
Wow. Well, we'll wish you well. We'll pray for you, and
thank you very much.
And yeah, we hope to maybe cross paths over there. Maybe.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
Yes,
yeah,
that would be great. When we go there every so often. So now, how has the book been received since publishing the book? The response, and it's not just available in Australia. You've got this available in the States.
Absolutely,
as well?
yes, it's available online through Amazon.
Yeah.
So all the major booksellers would carry the book, so it's easily available online. Of course, I would mainly direct people to Perusia.
There it
Please
is.
buy
that was perfect timing.
Please buy it from Perusia.
$29.95.
I want to thank them for supporting the book. Yes.
Yes. So fantastic. The Realist Guide to Religion and Science. Yeah, it's a great volume. The feedback. I mean, just the handful of people I've spoken to about it, they said it reads very well researched, and it's not so complex that you can't make sense. Some people fearful of diving into such a complex topic, but you've done a really good job in making it digestible, I guess, for people, and easy to follow. And that little on the cover, you've got this measurement. This pops up all the way.
Yes.
Measuring.
Yeah. What I call the epistodometer, to try to track people's worldview and their mentality, how they see reality. Yes.
Yes. That's so clever. So when you're reading this book, I don't know if I'm going to another zoom in, Jess. You've got the epistodometer.
Epistodometer.
This is what you're looking for. This features right throughout the book, and there it is. So depending on where you are on the scale, Father will let you know in there.
Yes, exactly.
Where your train of thought comes from.
Yes.
No, very good. Now, there is an interesting one. The big question is, let's answer this to start the discussion and,
Okay.
and then flow through.
Sure.
But is the church against science?
Absolutely not. And the one thing I think Catholics need to understand is not only is the Church not against science, but the Church, in fact, was at the origin of the scientific method, the specific method that we use today, that all scientists use today in order to discover laws of nature. So it's just an historical fact that was really unearthed by a Catholic scientist by the name of Pierre Duhem. So Pierre Duhem he lived in the early 1900s, was when he was sort of flourishing and doing his work as a university lecturer. But he really established the fact that the great scientific breakthroughs in the 17th century relied largely upon a method that had been developed in the 13th and the 14th centuries in the medieval Catholic world.
Wow. We're talking, so, 1100s, 1200s.
Yes. Well, the thing is, what he realized is that all of the pagan civilizations, because of the way they looked at reality, they just did not expect there to be laws, rational laws underpinning nature. All the pagan cultures saw the universe as existing forever, eternally, and they saw it as going in cycles, and they did not think there was a mind behind the universe. Even someone like Aristotle, who was able to achieve great advancements in philosophy, yet he thought that the universe was eternal and that the prime mover, his prime mover, did not embed laws into nature, that nature just was what it was. So there are no real laws behind it. So they just didn't expect to be able to discover laws. And they didn't look for the laws as a result. They just didn't think there was a mind behind nature. So when we come to the Middle Ages, there were various Catholic doctrines that inspired scientists to start looking for these laws. One of them was the fact that God is outside of the universe and that he is a wise God. So from the Catholic perspective, the standard Catholic position on God is that he's wise in the sense that we know that for humans, our intellect is prior to our will. So for a person who's functioning properly, we will make choices based on what we know to be true. So that's the way to act wisely, is you make choices based on what you know to be true. So your will, your choice, follows what you know. So they thought of God as being that way, that God does things in such a way that his choices follow his wisdom, and therefore he embeds in creation his wisdom, that there is a rational order to creation. And not only that, that we humans are created in the image of God. So we're able. You have a God who's wise, and he creates a nature that has wisdom embedded in it. Then he creates us who have reason, and we look at that nature, and we should be able to discover those laws, that rational order in nature.
Yes.
Yeah. So that theological perspective gave the medieval Catholics a great confidence in the ability of the human mind to discover a rational order in reality, and also that they would be able to use their senses and investigate matter, quantify matter, and make hypotheses about what the way matter was designed by God to run the universe in order to discover those laws. And that was really the beginning of the scientific method as we know it.
Wow, wow.
So at what point along the way then, I mean, obviously they would have developed these, their study and developed their theories, and at what point then did, I suppose, the church not separate itself from science, but at what point was it recognised that science and church were two different things, and at what point did we, as the human race, decide that these are two very separate things and must be kept apart, because that seems to be very much the sense of where we are now, is that science and religion don't go together. So where did those two things separate along the way?
Yeah, well, in the Middle Ages, quite often those who were theologians were also philosophers and scientists at the same time. So going back to ancient times, being a philosopher was effectively the same thing as being a scientist. It was only in the Middle Ages that science sort of was able to stand up on its own feet precisely by having its own method. Once you develop a new method for investigating reality and you're able to isolate that from other methods, then you're able to say, well, this method belongs to a different discipline of thought than that other method. So it was really in the Middle Ages that I guess scientists began to discover that we have a separate discipline here that concerns a different aspect of reality and a different way to discover truths about reality. So when was the exact break between science and philosophy? It was probably a few centuries later. It didn't happen in the Middle Ages as such. There was just clean separation, but the method was originated in the Middle Ages, and that was the start of that birth of science, wherein science would be able to grow into an adult and stand on its own feet as it does today.
You're known to quote what you would call the greatest Catholic scientist in the 20th century, Pierre Duhem, or
Duhem. Pierre Duhem, yes.
Could you tell us a bit about this man and what he managed to, I guess, achieve in his work?
Sure, yes. Well, Pierre Duhem, he was born in the 1800s. He died in 1916 in his 50s. He died of a heart attack. But he was an incredible researcher, a man with incredible energy. So he lived at a time there was great anti-clerical sentiment in France, and there was also the standard Enlightenment narrative that even exists to this day, that the Church has been against science throughout her history, especially built on the famous Galileo case. You know, everything rests on that. This whole sort of mythology that, well, the Middle Ages was a time when the Church was oppressing people and trying to keep them in a state of ignorance, because if people actually investigated reality, they would easily find that all that the Church claims is false, you know, blah, 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 blah. This sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, Galileo and Newton come out of nowhere. They're much more rational, and they're able to defeat the obscurantism of the Church by discovering facts about nature and do such things as show man his own insignificance and the fact that he's not important, that he's not, I don't know, I guess they draw all kinds of theological conclusions from things like heliocentrism. But what Pierre Duhem was able to do is he was a lecturer at a university in Bordeaux, and he was able to research the ancient sort of manuscripts from the Middle Ages and discover that Newton and Galileo were not sort of inventing the method that they were using. They were not inventing many of the theorems that they relied upon. We know that Newton himself says that he was standing on the shoulders of giants. Well, the problem was he wasn't footnoting that, so he wasn't indicating that so much in his writings, who he was relying upon. So it took that sort of got lost, that the fact that there were great medieval scientists such as Nicholas Orem, who was a bishop, Jean Buridan, who was a priest. You have Robert Grosseteste, a bishop of Lincoln, England, and many other figures who had done some groundwork in science that was later used by Galileo and Newton to have their theories. So what Duhem discovered was, far from the Church suppressing science during the Middle Ages, she had in fact created a society wherein scientists were able to explore these things, and it was the first time in the whole history of the world that this particular method for discovering laws of nature had been originated. So it was the total opposite of that narrative, and it's really striking today, Charbel and Mark, that historians are beginning to realize that what Pierre Duhem had discovered was, in fact, the truth. That they're beginning to admit. You can read books like by Rodney Stark, for instance, a sociologist. He has a book for the glory of God. He also has a book against anti-Catholic sentiment. He's not a Catholic himself, but he just says this is a historical record. This is a fact that the scientific method started in the Middle Ages, and so the Church definitely was not against science.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, is it possible that that there's this feel that if the Catholic Church can be seen as being involved in the development of the scientific method, then and they can basically align it to show that it doesn't operate outside the understanding of the faith, then maybe the faith is right, and so people feel the need just to beat it down and claim the method as their own and then reinterpret it?
Well, I think the fact that the scientific method originated in the Middle Ages and on the basis of a theological view, in the sense that, as we were discussing, it was really the perspective on reality that the Church gave Catholics that enabled them to think that the quantification, observation, experimentation, quantification, and use of mathematical formulas would help tell you something about the laws of nature. The fact that their theologies gave them insight into reality might make us think that, in fact, that theology comes from the same God that created reality. You know, that the one who's at the origin of nature, if there's a theology out there that helps people understand nature better, then maybe it's the same God who's behind both. So I think that really an interesting apologetical argument for the truth of the Catholic faith, that the Catholic faith was the only sort of belief system that was able to create a culture that was able to discover laws of nature or even think that there were laws of nature. So it's just a very interesting historical fact to show that Catholic theology and reality fit seamlessly together.
Go hand in hand.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. We've got, like, Galileo and Newton were, as you would say, giants at the time. And what did they, I guess, just to spell it out for us in this environment, they achieved, they basically put it back on the map that the Church is not against science. But what exactly could we say about them? What did they do for us at that time?
So if the method for discovering the laws of nature was originated in the Middle Ages, it was Galileo and Newton who first actually discovered those laws. So the actual discoveries did not take place until Galileo and Newton, especially Newton, the three laws of Newton. So the first law of Newton, the law of inertia, was more or less formulated in the Middle Ages. But the more important law of Newton, the one that made him such a huge figure for the rest of the history of science, was his law of gravitation.
Okay.
So what Newton did, you know, we all know this famous story of Newton sitting under a tree, you know, and an apple plunking down on his head. So what he said was, well, maybe that same force that's causing the apple to drop to the ground is the force that causes the moon to rotate around the Earth and the Earth to rotate around the sun. So this force of gravitation that draws the apple to the ground, it might be the same thing that's causing the moon to be gravitationally attracted to the Earth. So then I can measure that force and then apply it to the planetary system. And that's what he did, and that's what he came up with, his universal law of gravitation, a law of nature.
Yes.
Yes. To describe a force that exists in nature for the entire universe. So there you have an example of using the scientific method to discover a law that's embedded in the very fabric of our universe.
Yeah, absolutely. And we actually have Darwin, just the next row down, and that's Father's blog right there. If you click on that blog, this is Father Paul Robinson, where it says Darwin, and it was put together last week. This opens up to one of your blogs you've had, Evolution, talking about who is Darwin, and going through some images there. So it's nicely laid out, and there's some references as well, links, and so it's really nicely done. It's a good read. Encourage you to do that. The context of Darwin's work, and managed to find some images that would work with it. His loss of faith, so that's interesting, and might touch on that. Do you remember writing this piece, Father? It was this article. Tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, well, the genesis of this paper is it's actually a five-part paper. Was the rector at the seminary which I teach was asking me to sort of explain to the seminarians the theory of Darwin, and sort of my perspective on why it falls short as an explanatory mechanism for the arrival of many different life forms on Earth. So it's definitely covered it already in my book, in chapter 11 of my book, but what people will get through this blog series is a sort of summary of that teaching. So,
okay.
Yes. So I think on the side of the church, this is one of those questions where the church says to us, you're not obliged to believe either way. That we have a certain freedom as Catholics to explore the scientific evidence of whether this mechanism that Darwin proposes of random mutation, natural selection, is able to count for the origin of life forms or not. So we just look at the scientific evidence and whether it shows that Darwin's mechanism is able to explain everything, or whether science shows that it isn't. We know that it comes from God, so it's not going to compromise our faith either way. We know that God had to directly create human beings, the first human beings, Adam and Eve, but all of the other life forms, they could have originated by some sort of natural process that God embedded into nature. There's no problem believing that. So, but the thing is, it has to be backed up by scientific evidence, solid scientific evidence. And I think when Darwin proposed his theory back 150 years ago, it was plausible. That people had come up with very plausible naturalistic theories to explain the origin of geological forms on this Earth, the geological formations. We think now it's very clear that it's just long-term processes that have caused the formations of the various features of the Earth. They weren't, in other words, the Earth wasn't just created this way, the way we see it today. That originally it was covered with water, and then slowly the crust formed, as is described in the second day of Genesis, and then over time you have the atmosphere of the Earth thins out, and the various sort of continents form, that sort of thing, over a long period of time. So what Darwin was trying to speculate is perhaps nature also is able to produce different forms of life, and he proposed a theory as to how that would take place. So he didn't have enough sort of scientific tools and field studies at the time to thoroughly investigate his theory. And we now have much more information than he had, especially at the biochemical level, at the level of the DNA and the cell. We know so much about the cell today. It's absolutely fascinating. But one major thing that Darwin did not know that we know today is that every single living thing, whether it be a bacterium, a protozoa, or a plant, or an animal, or a human being, all of them run on cells. And every single cell contains a coded language, similar to like a programming language. You think of Java or C++, what have you, where you have this language that contains instructions that are then interpreted by a compiler and executed on the computer. Well, our DNA works like that. So it's not just a question of chemical combinations that are going on in the cell, but the cell knows the code of DNA, and it understands what the DNA is saying, and it interprets it, and it executes these instructions in order to build the various molecular machines in the cell, and basically specify what these machines and these cells are to be doing at a level of complexity that really boggles the mind. It's far beyond any technology that we've ever developed as human beings. So if you look into a cell and you find that there's a coded language there, you ask yourself, is nature able to produce that on its own? And the clear answer is obviously not. There's absolutely no way for nature to do that. So there's no way for nature to take just mere chemicals and construct a coded language in the first place. And then once you have life forms, then is nature able of its own power to sort of rewrite the code in order to make another animal? That of itself, nature is not capable of doing that. So the Darwin's mechanism of random mutation, natural selection, where you have just little changes, little genetic changes that slowly over time develop into drastically different animals, we know now that it's only able to do just a little bit, just little changes like the famous finches on the Galapagos Islands. So on the Galapagos Islands, you had a drought, for instance, and the birds with the bigger beaks were able to break into seeds that were harder. So all the soft seeds were eaten up, and so the birds with the bigger beaks were the only ones able to survive because they were able to eat the seeds that were harder. So when you have only the big beak birds surviving, then you get a bunch of finches with big beaks. It's sort of like a new breed of dog.
Yes.
All right. So Darwin's mechanism is able to explain that, but that's about as far as it can go. Just sort of little new species, new biological species of finches, other changes and little changes in bacteria, but not a radical diversification of animals. It's incapable of explaining that.
Adaptation is what would that be closer to that? Or is that what we're
Yes.
talking about here? You can adapt to sort of the environment around you or the circumstances?
Yes, it's that adaptation that accounts for the changes in the finches or the changes in various fish in the lakes of Africa or what have you. And Darwin was speculating that perhaps that adaptation has no limit, that it can keep going, that you can have that effectively there's no boundaries on the variation possibilities of plants and animals, that they can keep varying so much that they can turn into drastically different things. But again, a thing that we know now is that one thing they've been able to do since Darwin proposed his theory is push the boundaries of various species. There's something called saturation mutagenesis, where you take the whole genetic code of like a fruit fly, and you change the genetic code when the embryo is developing, and you change all the genes. And what they've discovered is that you can get, most of the time you just get dead fruit flies. So most of the time it doesn't, you don't get anything fruitful, to use another pun. But you do have some big changes in the sense that you have an extra pair of wings, or you have like a leg, and this has actually happened, a leg growing out of the head of the fruit fly. But you don't get anything that changes the fruit fly into a different animal. So they've tried all the possibilities.
So that famous image of the monkey, the gorilla, and then the human being.
Evolution.
Yes. Well, that image is really based on the fossil record, and this is something that would lend credence to the Darwinian narrative, is the fact that it's an objective fact that in the fossil record there is a progression from simple to complex.
Okay.
So you see at the beginning of the fossil record just plants, and then you've got very basic animals, and then more complex animals, like fish. Then you go on to reptiles, and you go on to invertebrates and invertebrates, and the last is man. So because you see that progression in the fossil record, you might think, well, maybe it's just nature itself that produced those changes. So that is the strongest evidence that Darwin has to support his theory. And I think a lot of evolutionists would point to that and say, well, look at the fossil record. Doesn't that clearly show that Darwin must be correct? Well, no, it doesn't. It does show that there is a progression from simple to complex, but it doesn't show how that progression happened. Yeah. Could have happened through random mutation, natural selection. Could have been something else. And there are other facts about the fossil record that make us think that it definitely wasn't Darwinian evolution. And this is that Darwin predicted that there would be a very gradual change from simple to complex animals. And we just do not see that in the fossil record. What we see is all of a sudden insertions of new animals that are drastically different from the ones that went before. If Darwin was correct, we would see this very gradual change, slow changes or diversification of animals in a smooth continuum, as it were, from the simplest animal to the most complex animal. We do not see that. There's something called, especially the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion is a certain pulse in the geological record where you can go all around the world, you can dig down, and there's a certain layer where all of a sudden these new animals appear with drastically different body plans. The body plan is called the phylum, and they just appear out of nowhere. So there's the fact that it's so sudden defeats the Darwinian vision of a gradual transition between animals.
Wow. Wow. It's fascinating because there's so much talk about. We were sort of just, playing with a big brush, just, the Big Bang happened, evolution happened, we just accept it.
Yes.
And then there's no way, because of that, there's no God. And then the church has sort of pulled back saying, hang on.
Yes.
Let's look at this. And there could be elements of truth here that we could have, but to sort of just, we sort of tend to jump into camps, unfortunately, today, without doing the research. And
exactly.
And I'm for evolution, full stop. Done.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, okay, explain that.
Yes.
And then I'm for the creation. It's almost like creation is versus evolution.
Right.
Is that the right thing to say? Can you say creationism versus evolution, or there is a little bit of overlap here?
In my mind, Charbel, I think what's unfortunate is often people only see a sort of a two-tone narrative going on here.
Yeah.
One is the radical atheist who try to account with absolutely everything with purely natural causes. And I try to explain in my book how that does lead to irrationality. Like the Big Bang itself, which I think the Big Bang has solid science behind it. And the church doesn't, again, gives us freedom on that. But if the Big Bang is true, then of course there has to be a God behind it. I mean, if science is saying that space and time originate with this sudden burst of energy way back 13.7 billion years ago, then you need a mega cause behind that.
Yes, yes.
Obviously, a transcendent God who's outside of space and time. So that's the atheist narrative, and if it leads to irrationality. But then you also have the fundamentalist creationists, especially certain creationist groups among the Protestants, who say that the Bible teaches that the earth is only 6,000 years old, and they will not allow for any sort of development of the universe, any long history of the universe. God had simply to create everything instantaneously, fully formed. And they won't allow God, as it were, to have any sort of development or naturalistic history to the universe. And that people just see those as the two positions. But that position as well, as I explained in chapter 7, it leads to certain irrationalities, because if you have things like the geological formations that are clearly something that took place over long periods of time. I give the example of Pluto. We just did a flyby, the first flyby of the human race of Pluto where you can get high detailed images of Pluto. That happened in I think it was 2015 or 2012, but there's formations on there that clearly took more than 6,000 years to form. All right. So again, there is
still an official planet, by the way.
It's not. It's not.
Not currently, but who knows what happens next week.
That was part of the 9.
Yes.
So okay.
It's not. It's been demoted. Some people were very sad about that.
Yeah. My favourite planet, Pluto. Outside of Earth, of course. Pluto was always.
It disorders the order of the planets that we grew up learning.
That's right.
Yes, exactly.
Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Pluto. Oh,
that's right.
Up there.
So the Catholic position is neither the one nor the other. It's not this fundamentalist Protestant position where we have to say that Genesis or the Bible teaches a 6,000-year-old Earth. Church has given us freedom, says the Bible doesn't teach chronology. And it's also not this radically atheistic position where everything has to be evolved. The Church says to us, look, here's what you have to believe according to the faith. Whatever happens in nature has to be according to the plan of God. And then for the rest, let science decide. Just investigate. And from my perspective, that I think on the side of astronomy and geology, for the development of inanimate things, chemicals, things that are non-living, it seems like God has embedded a very intricate fine-tuning of the universe for the universe to develop in that way. But with regards to biological life forms, they're so vastly complex that and the laws of nature are completely inadequate for forming those things, I'm convinced that God must have directly created a lot of the life forms.
Wow, wow.
When you say let science decide, do you mean like that let science discover? Because it's one way or the other, isn't it? Like I'm not trying to get into one camp or the other, but ultimately there's only one truth to how the earth and all of us came into existence. If the church at the moment is saying you can believe this, you can believe that, there's no solid direction or teaching from the church on this matter, first of all, is it important that we come to a discovery about how everything came into existence, or is it always going to be just seeing that that might have been this, it might have been that? And if so, why is it important for us to spend so much time? And the discussions on this topic can get really heated, and people can get really passionate about one view or the other. Why is it important? If the church doesn't feel the need to make a decision one way or the other because the discovery of the reality of it hasn't come about yet, why is it important to study it?
Well, I think one thing is that it's fascinating for us, and I think there's a certain
human curiosity. Basically.
Human curiosity. Yes. we love to learn these things, and what we were discussing previously about the fact that God has given us rational powers, and He hasn't wanted to reveal everything to us. He could have revealed all these natural secrets to us, but I think He knows that He would have taken away from us a certain joy of discovering them.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
So each age is able to discover more and more of the secrets of what God has embedded into the universe, and we have a certain joy with that and a certain fascination. It's hopefully supposed to lead us to admire the glory of God more.
I really appreciate that answer, because from what you're saying there, it's the discovery is something to attain, something for us to strive for, and it's not about proving the other side wrong as much as let's just find out what happened and how it happened, and then the why it happened is understood that much better then, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
It is. And I mean, I have to admit openly that I'm a bit of a geek. I mean, so these things absolutely fascinate me, and I just love reading science books and say, well, what's the latest thing they've discovered? And it's just, for me, it's absolutely amazing. I mean, I think about, for instance, the fact that 200 years ago, nobody knew that there was anything beyond the Milky Way, for instance.
Yeah.
They didn't know anything about DNA, and we just have so much evidence today that of the absolute incredible wisdom of God and the intricate order of nature, that I almost feel privileged to live in these times, in a sense. You know, it's a shame for me that people are so atheistic today and they're so secularized. It's kind of ironic. We have more evidence today of the fact that there is a very glorious being behind the created order than has ever been attained in the history of the world. Yeah, but people are just not drawing those conclusions because we're so secularized.
So true, so true. Yeah, we've got to avoid the heated arguments always fitting in a camp like a fan base.
Well, in any topic, whether it's this or anything, as soon as the argument or the discussion becomes an argument and that argument becomes heated, it's nearly not worth having the argument. You've nearly got to walk away from it and
this
start
is where
again.
we're at the moment. It's almost
exactly
like we look past science and we've sort of the identity politics, and it's we're now we're almost not listening to science at all.
No, it's come down to personal opinion.
It's gone down.
Yeah.
What is it? What is gender? What is what makes up the human person?
Wow.
These topics are quite heated and confused, and the church for so many years has been accused of not being scientific. Now gets to the point where it shows you it's scientific.
Yes.
And then now we're not going to accept that. We're going to look at that, and we're going to just keep going. And it's just almost like, wow, we're in an age where we're past science. We've got to rediscover this and put it back on the map, so to speak, and talk about it again. And I think people can appreciate that. And it's time to do that. Just get this out there. So get this book. I highly recommend this book. This is fascinating. We're only touching the surface.
Yes.
Really not doing it justice here. We need to do a few more hours on this topic. But fantastic. You almost need a whole series, I think. I see Father teaching a whole series,
talking
you know.
about it. Yeah, that's a good
That would be
idea.
great.
I'll look into
A
that.
whole online series. Let's see where that goes. But
Realist, right.
if people want to stay in touch with you, you do have an online presence.
Yes, I do have a blog online.
Yes.
And there's a website for the book, therealistguide.com.
Yes.
And the blog is up there. The evolution series is up there, the 5-part evolution series.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and I hope that people will find reading it that there is a complete objectivity and the fact that going into it, because I'm a Catholic and the Church tells me I don't have to vote for one side or the other.
Yes.
That there is a certain detachment from
Yes.
the conclusions that we'll find. I'm ready to find any evidence that will point in any direction. I know that whatever it is, God will be behind it, and it's not going to compromise my faith. But I just put honestly, with all of my extensive hours in my nerd cave reading, what the conclusions that I think are actually correspond to reality.
How long did it take you to put this book together? And I know that's probably a difficult question to answer because different things along the way have contributed to it, not necessarily directly. But
Yes.
but how long would it take you to put something like that together?
It was a year and a half to write it, and then a year and a half to publish effectively.
Okay.
Yeah, but once you get into a topic and you get interested about it or even obsessed about it, you just keep reading. You just keep reading more and more books. Yes.
Oh, fantastic. Is there going to be a sequel? You got any plans of anything else coming out?
No sequel planned at the moment. Just really been trying to promote the book on the blog and write articles in relation to the
Yes,
book. That's
excellent.
mainly where my writing efforts have been directed since its publication.
We'll keep sharing those as well.
Yeah,
So keep
thank
them
you so
coming.
much. Yeah.
Thank you for joining on the show, Father.
Yeah.
It's great to
Thank
have
you
you
so
here
much
in
for
person.
having me on the
We wish
show.
you all the best over in Denver, Colorado, and hope to see you over there at
Yeah.
some point. Please pray for Father Paul Robertson, the author of the Realist Guide to Religion and Science, available right now at parissiomedia.com at a bargain price. It's normally $50 elsewhere, but you get it for
$39.99.
$39.99. That's right. $39.99 is the price. Very good. So it's normally $50 wherever you go. So
That's right.
That's a great price. So please